U.S. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump are virtual locks to win their party's nominations and face off in November. However, they each face a big challenge: the number of Americans who don't want to vote for either of these candidates. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. As the remaining candidates dropped out following Super Tuesday primaries, the path is cleared for another rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in the battle for the White House. They are already in campaign mode, exchanging barbs, but a recent poll showed that both candidates are facing a similar problem. Many Americans are not happy with either of these choices. According to an ABC News Ipsos poll, 30% of voters think neither of them will do a good job leading the country. The poll found that the majority of independents, 37%, trust neither of them to do a good job as president. What impact will all of this have on the election? Can the candidates change voters' minds between now and November? To help us answer these questions, let's bring in our panel. Here with us in studio is Joel Rubin, a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Joseph Williams here in Washington, D.C. He's a former senior editor at the U.S. News and World Report. From Miami, Jadan Horyn is a political analyst. And from Wilmington, Delaware, Brice is a conservative columnist and radio talk show host. Welcome, all of you, to the show. Joel, I'm going to start with you. These latest polls, we know about this enthusiasm gap. It's been traced pretty much through this whole campaign. A large number of voters not happy with either candidate. But when you look at independents, which often swing these elections, as you know, the poll shows 32% trust Biden, 31% trust Trump, 37% are like, ugh. What does this mean in terms of the election? Do you see this kind of having a major impact?
Well, Mike, it's great to be with you and with my colleague panelists. Look, without a doubt, all the voters in the country right now are burnt out, quite frankly. Burnt out of President Biden, burnt out of Donald Trump. I bet if we had the election tomorrow, we would see the same results that we'll see 7 months from now or 8 months from now when it actually takes place. These are known candidates. But the thing about independents is that when the case is made, and it will be made, about the extremism of Donald Trump and his agenda and how he has essentially told women they are second-class citizens in the United States, told Americans that he doesn't care about the sanctity of elections or democracy, told the country he doesn't care about their health. I think that case is going to be made very clear for the next 8 months, and so we'll see those independents move towards President Biden as they did in 2020, but it's going to be a really long, hard slog.
Joseph, the polls showing that 1 in 5 Americans have unfavorable views of both candidates, and just piggybacking off what Joel said, people are already burned out. I can only imagine leading up to November, people are going to be like, oh, saturated with all these ads and everything. Is the big concern that a lot of people are just going to sit on their hands, stay at home, sit on the couch, say, I'm not even voting?
I think that is a big concern, particularly on the Democrat side. Now, Joe Biden is only now getting into campaign mode, as we saw during the State of the Union address and during his competing speeches with Donald Trump over the weekend. And I think that Joel is right. I think that once voters start getting more tuned in, as Biden gets more dialed in, they will be able to distinguish between the two candidates. And even though they may shrug their shoulders and say, well, I really don't like either one of these guys, I think when it comes right down to it, the bases are going to determine this election, and probably whatever either candidate can chip off from the center. In the case of Biden, he's starting with a slightly more favorable hand in that he's got visibility. He's starting to gain visibility, whereas Trump has had visibility all summer, not necessarily in the ways that you would like if you're an independent voter. I mean, keep in mind, we're still facing the start of at least one trial before the election, possibly 2. We've got more headlines that are likely to come out in terms of the Georgia case, in terms of the case in New York City with Stormy Daniels and the hush money payoff. So there's a lot of negative headlines ahead of former President Trump. That being said, 3 to 5 months in politics is a lifetime, but it's also no time. So paradoxically, anything can happen with Joe Biden between those months, between the months now and the election. Right now, he's riding high. We probably know and should expect that there's going to be a wave, that he's going to face some headwinds, It's not going to be smooth sailing the whole way. Egypt, and rather not Egypt, but the war in the Middle East between Hamas and Israel is likely to stick in a lot of voters' craws. Certainly young voters are not going to be really happy about how this plays out unless he can get a ceasefire and some traction. So it is, to echo Joel, it's going to be a long, hard slog. But I think that once voters finally get dialed in, they're going to respond, and they're going to respond much like they did, I believe, in 2020. They're going to sense an opportunity to make a change, and they're going to take those opportunities, I think, by the time November rolls around.
Brandon, I've been watching you. You've been looking askance, spotting your lip. I know you want to jump in here. What are your thoughts?
You know, I think the thing we're not talking about is who will Trump, who clearly is going to be the nominee, who will he pick as his vice president? I think one of the things we're looking at is we know that that Trump has had issues with women in the past, which tells me Trump's VP pick will have to be a woman just to even solidify the base. But furthermore, let's look at even, not only are the American people tired of two of the same old guys who are both approaching 80. Let's look at that. But second is that when you look at Joe Biden, one of the biggest challenges has been two things: the economy, which is still fragile, and the fact that no one's talking about Kamala Harris, which tells me that the American people may have trust in him, but they don't have trust in his vice president. So I think what's going to be the thing that's going to determine who takes the White House for 2024 is looking at who Donald Trump selects as his vice president, which, if it were up to me, whether you like Nikki Haley or not, to me, she's the only choice that gets this guy back in the White House. But the other thing is take the opportunity to look at Israel. This will come down to Joe Biden's handle of Israel and the Middle East. And I can tell you right now, many Jewish American voters are not happy with Biden, who typically vote Democrat, which means at the end of the day, if you stay home, it is a vote for Donald Trump, whether you like it or not.
Joel, you are a Jewish voter, so I want to give you a chance to chime in there.
Well, I won't speak for all of us, but I will speak for me, and what I'm sensing from the community is that Joe Biden is very popular. Democrats are very popular. There is no nostalgia for the domestic turmoil of Donald Trump and his cajoling and cavorting with white supremacists and all of the hate speech that he promoted here. So Joe Biden, American Jews understand, has Israel's back. There are some concerns about what's going to happen next with Israel, but there's no diminishment of that. If anything, the base of the party is very concerned from the other side about the president, but I'd say that over time they'll see that he is doing all he can to bring calm to that region.
Jaden, I want to invite you into the conversation. Brandon was just talking about Nikki Haley. She dropped out, but looking at just some of the numbers, 43% of the votes in New Hampshire, 34% in Virginia. Trump undoubtedly has the base locked up, but there is this part of the Republican Party that's still kind of, I don't want to say they're never Trumpers, but maybe they want that Nikki Haley kind of candidate from the past, tough when it comes to defense and tough when it comes to budgets. Does he have a problem with part of the Republican base?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the same problem that Donald Trump had in 2016 and 2020. And it's that, he has a ceiling and there is a floor. And we know that Republican voters, upwards of 30% to 40%, would prefer a candidate other than Donald Trump. And that will continue to pose an issue going into an election season where the distribution of those voters happen to be in the suburbs. And without a doubt, Donald Trump needs to pull even or win the suburbs in order to win the presidency. So the kind of aggregation of those voters in politically powerful places plays a similar calculus on the Democratic side. The uncommitted voters in both Michigan and Minnesota potentially pose a risk to Joe Biden, because if they decide to sit out, those margins, those voters could make a difference in both of those states and tilt them towards the Republican column. Voters do not want either candidate, but voters will have both candidates. So it's really a question of whether or not the American people are willing to look at other options, sit out entirely, or decide, the better of the two options.
Yeah, but Jaden, let me ask you about the premise that Brandon put forward of Trump picking Nikki Haley. And we've seen that in the past where Ronald Reagan picked George H.W. Bush to be his running mate, and Lyndon Johnson joining the Kennedy ticket. It's been done in the past, but this doesn't really seem like something that Donald Trump would be anxious to do. It doesn't kind of follow his playbook. Do you think there's any chance that could actually happen?
And I think the most famous example of a conservative Republican choosing kind of the establishment candidate would be Ronald Reagan with George H.W. Bush. And it was a tenuous alliance to win. Of course, it won in a landslide. But, that division within the Republican Party has existed since the 1960s and 70s. It hasn't gone away. But Donald Trump uniquely is the person that's least likely to do this because it's personal animus. He famously said that if you donate to Nikki Haley, you're out of the MAGA movement. So, to do an about face like that would probably turn off his supporters. And I will say this, as much as his supporters like Donald Trump, they are a movement outside of Donald Trump, and they are thinking beyond the 2024 election. So that would be seen, essentially as caving to the establishment that has offshored our industries, that has made the U.S. unsafe around the world, that's domestically spies, that puts companies over people. That I just don't see the president being able to, the former president being able to do.
Joseph, I'm going back quite a few years, but I worked in the St. Louis market, and I'll never forget when Dick Gebhardt dropped out. Michael Dukakis came to his church along with Lloyd Benson, and they did this photo op, and it's bringing the party together. And you've seen this in the past, but you don't see, as Jadan just pointed out, Trump really even wants to do that. I mean, he's kind of vilified Romney, Nikki Haley. Is that going to be a problem for him come November?
Well, it has been a problem for him since. I mean, there are two things that occurred to me. One, I agree with Jadan that yes, it is personal with Donald Trump, especially as far as the VP pick. And normally that's where a presidential candidate reaches out to the different wings of his party and tries to bring the party together under one unified person that's along with him on the ticket. Number one, I do agree with Jadan, it's going to be personal with Trump, or it is personal with Trump. But I kind of can see Brandon's point if I squint, right? I mean, you do have Donald Trump who has a streak of pragmatism in him, deep down in there somewhere. I mean, he didn't know very much about Mike Pence. He didn't really align very much with Mike Pence, yet he picked him as his vice president. In terms of Nikki Haley, yes, she would definitely bring something to the table that Trump absolutely needs. And if he has a scintilla of the businessman left in him, he understands that if 30% of the market is not buying your product, you need to figure out how to either change your product or bring that 30% on board. So yes, there is a world where I can see Donald Trump picking Nikki Haley as his VP. I mean, consider the case of Nancy Mace, who voted against him for impeachment, and Trump very famously singled her out and asked her, or put out a curtain call or call for a candidate to run against her in South Carolina, and yet she got back on the MAGA bus, and now she's in Trump's good graces to the point where he's helping her fundraise. So there is a universe in which that can happen. In Donald Trump's universe, it's a coin toss to me, but I also think that that's one way that he could bring the big tent together. He doesn't seem very interested in that, hasn't seemed very interested in that, mainly because when he says jump, the GOP says how high, because they know he's the guy who's bringing the votes to the table.
Joel, I saw you shaking your head. You don't think the likelihood of Nikki Haley joining this ticket is very high?
No, I don't. Look, she hasn't even endorsed Donald Trump, so it's still very theoretical. I was going to joke as well. It certainly won't be Katie Britt, who was given an audition the other night as well and flubbed in the most dramatic of ways. But I do think Trump, he needs to have some balance in his ticket. But what is that balance? Is it gender? Is it ideology? Is it establishment? Who knows? I think, frankly, he wants sycophants. And that's where I think he's going to go with this, is to have a sort of a mini-me, even if they don't look exactly like him, which is hard to do anyways. I think that we're going to find him picking someone who's essentially him in a different human being.
Let me follow up that question with another that comes to mind, which is, we're talking about the polling data, and you mentioned it too. People know who these two candidates are. They're not crazy about them. This no labels candidacy, there's been a lot of talk about that. Of course, they were flirting with Joe Manchin. He said, no way. Larry Hogan, who's now running for the Senate in Maryland, said, no way. They haven't really come up with a candidate, but they don't seem to be going away. What kind of impact do you think they'll have in this election?
Well, I'm hearing that they're imploding. I don't think they're finding a standard bearer who can really carry any votes and does not want to be seen as the spoiler who gives the election to Donald Trump, because that's what it would be, Mike, is this essentially if no labels gets in, they will swing the election to Donald Trump. This has happened to Democrats before. It happened in 2000 when Ralph Nader was on the ticket and undermined Al Gore's candidacy and ushered in a horrible presidency on many levels from the Democratic perspective. So I think I think they're going to dissipate over time. But I do want to also mention that polls matter, but also what we've seen in recent votes matters. And on the votes since 2022, including the midterms, Democrats have outperformed the polls consistently and won in the midterms compared to what was expected, as well as in referenda. And Republicans, in the other direction, we see Nikki Haley doing much better than was expected. So while polls are saying one thing, people, when they get a chance to go to the ballot box, are going more for Joe Biden on the Democratic side and less for Donald Trump on the Republican side, certainly in the recent months.
Joseph, Joel says they're going to implode, but the chairman of No Labels made a warning to the Democratic Party over the weekend. We've got some sound. Let's watch this. I want to get your reaction on the other side.
We're going to get run over by the Donald Trump train, okay? We didn't tie the Democrats to this track. We were the ones that saw this coming and say, get off the track. Let's do this in a different way.
So what's your view on what he just said?
Well, my view is that it's a little bit stilted. I mean, it's a little bit askew because it's not necessarily the fact that the Democrats are too far left. It's the fact that the center hasn't held for anything. If anything, the Democrats have been playing to their base, and that has been successful. I mean, mindful of what Joel had just mentioned, the fact that Democrats ran the table on referendum, they did much better than they were expected to do in the midterm elections. They still have that momentum going against them. They still have a very unpopular candidate in Donald Trump, who has done some very unpopular things, most notably stacking the court so that they reverse Roe v. Wade. Now, they may come up with a candidate, but certainly they've not got a message. They don't necessarily have anybody who can bring in more money, and it's hard to see how the third-party candidate can even emerge in time to make a dent before November. Because keep in mind, by this time rolled around, the last time we had some viable third-party candidates, they were already established names. They were already running in primaries. They were already, people knew who they were. So I don't think it's going to make much of a challenge, but if it does, the Democrats do need to be concerned about that.
And Brandon, let me ask you about this as well. I mean, when I think about a third-party candidate really making a dent, we think of Ross Perot, which was many years ago, but it seemed like he siphoned off more votes from Bush than he did Clinton. There's also the risk there, too, for Trump as well. Or do you see this as the Democrats are on the tracks and the Trump train's on its way?
I think, again, I go back to, anytime you have a third party candidate, they're going to take votes from someone. Now, with that said, I think in this instance, this is one unique opportunity where you have two, let me say this again, two barely almost 80-year-old men that neither the country wants. So if there was ever a time for a third party candidate, this would be it. But here's the problem. They got to be able to raise money. And right now, both Trump and the Biden campaign, they have the money, and it seems like they're the ones who only have the resources to be successful in this race. But let me also say this. When you look at, a third-party candidate, I think right now, again, I go back to it depends on who Trump picks as his vice president, because let's be honest, the next 4 years, and I wish this on no one, but the vice president in this race becomes critical on both sides. And I can tell you right now, the American people, you never hear about Vice President Kamala Harris until recently. Most people are not in favor of Joe Biden's vice president, which is another conversation. But again, the VP will determine the way the country goes and the way those 36 or 44% of independents swing in November.
Jadan, how do you see No Labels playing into this race?
No Labels had an opportunity to really do a top-tier recruit, and they haven't had the chance. What I can say is that, they could possibly form some kind of alliance with, RFK Jr. and, get behind the machinery that he is attempting to do. He is polling roughly in a five-way race around 14%. But again, absent an independent candidate getting electoral votes, absent that, what will happen is it will siphon votes most likely from Joe Biden, because that's where Americans are. That's our incumbent, and that's who they're most immediately dissatisfied with. So it's really a question for Democrats about how they're going to appeal to independent voters. Are they going to run to the base like Joe Biden did? Are they going to run to the base like Donald Trump has done? Or or are they going to find a way to get back to the middle to appeal to them? Because if not, 16.9%, which is current polling of the aggregate of the other three independents in the race, will say no to either. And that will definitely have an impact somewhere.
And Jadan, you spoke of Biden. He's in campaign mode. He was at a rally in Georgia. Let's listen to what he had to say, and I want to get your reaction on the other side.
It's not hyperbole to suggest our freedoms are literally on the ballot this November. Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans are trying to take our freedoms away. And by the way, not all Republicans. This ain't your father's Republican Party. These guys are different.
Is that going to be the major theme in this election, and is it going to resonate?
I mean, it resonates in the suburbs, right? Joe Biden won Georgia on the strength of the black vote, but more specifically on the strength of the suburbs that turned away from Donald Trump, the suburbs that overwhelmingly in Georgia and outside of Atlanta had supported every Republican candidate, including the current governor. So yes, that does resonate with that subset of voters. But if that is what the working class is going to hear of all races, then the Democrats will have a problem.
Joseph, former President Donald Trump campaigning, and guess what state? Georgia as well. So let's listen to what he had to say.
He's a threat to democracy. I will tell you, he's a threat to democracy. Weaponize government, weaponize the FBI, weaponize the DOJ. He's a threat to democracy.
So you've got two candidates who kind of agree on one thing, that each candidate's a threat to democracy.
What's the I'm rubber, you're glue strategy that Donald Trump has kind of perfected over his lifetime as a politician? I don't think people will be hearing that. The independents are going to be hearing that, mainly because it's sort of like, well, one of these guys is lying. Well, who has the stronger track record on that regard? And that would be Trump. And I do think that he's not going to be able to play the hits for very much longer. And I do believe that people are going to, Joe Biden has very clearly signaled that he's going to be using January 6th very much as a campaign cudgel against Donald Trump. And I think that's going to stick, mainly because people are still kind of sorting that out. And we still have trials related to January 6th going on. So according to what Biden is doing, it may be a strategy that will drag the race further down to the mud, but only one guy can come out on top. And it seems like it could be something that independents and the suburban voters are more willing to hear, and that certainly Donald Trump is playing absolutely to his base by saying that he's the real victim here and that Joe Biden is the perpetrator. So I don't see it resonating very far beyond Donald Trump's base, and I think that's what he's got to worry about.
And Joel, the interesting thing is I pointed out that Biden's in Georgia and Trump's in Georgia.
Yeah.
And we think about President of the United States, but it's really President of Georgia and Arizona and Florida and North Carolina and Wisconsin. I mean, it's all these kind of Pennsylvania,
right.
These states that are critically important. They're just on the fringe there. Arizona, I don't know if I mentioned that or not. But these are the states that really, it comes down, razor-thin wins and in these states can make all the difference in the world. Where are we going to see this campaign in terms of it playing out? Where are we going to see these candidates?
I mean, these 6 to 8 months.
They're calling you right now with the answer.
Who knew? Well, the campaign, look, they're putting their money into 6 to 8 states, these purple states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia. These are the swing states that are really where it's going to be fought. And in fact, if you're in those states, you think the election was tomorrow. And if you're in the rest of the country, you don't even know there's an election happening, because that's not where the money is going to go. And the campaign knows it, and they're sending surrogates there. I think we're going to see a lot of the shadow boxing like we just did between President Biden and Donald Trump. They were at the border on the same day the previous week. And one thing I want to mention also about the democracy argument by Donald Trump, we have a term, it's called gaslighting. But I think that Donald Trump, by speaking to democracy as a problem for Joe Biden and his worldview, implies that democracy is on the ballot. It means that his polling shows that he is weak in that area and that Americans care about that. And there is no way he can get away from or separate himself from the insurrection of January 6th. And that is just a physical manifestation of the threat to democracy he poses. And I guarantee, as we've been talking about, we are going to see ads with that riot at the Capitol again and again in these swing states. And these are the states where tens of thousands of votes can determine the future of this country.
Brandon, let me ask you about, we know that that's going to be the issue that Biden's going to be talking about. It feels like Trump's going to spend a lot of time talking about immigration. What do you see as the main issues as we get closer to November?
I think the border is going to be a very critical issue, the fact that you're going to see more of Trump talking about our security at the border. But again, I go back to, whether we're talking about the Middle East, whether we're talking about any issues, it's going to come back to, are you better now economically? Pocketbook issues, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And prior to the recent State of the Union, most Americans would probably say no.
And Joseph, let me ask you about the border, because Brandon says it's going to be a key issue. The Republicans really had a chance after the State of the Union address to kind of maybe appeal to younger voters. They had a young senator from Alabama, to women voters, which obviously is going to be an issue for them. And immigration was the story that she told, and yet Katie Britt was talking about a different president, the whole story kind of fell apart in the days that followed. Does that undermine the Republican argument? Or is that just a blip on the radar?
I think it's both. I think it's both a blip in the radar, and it also could serve as a longer-term strategy if the Biden campaign wanted to use it to kind of undermine the real threat here, because you do have a lot of talk about crime. You do have a lot of talk about immigrants being linked to crime. That really hasn't materialized a whole lot even in some of these cities that have been receiving immigrants bused to them from Texas and Arizona. There really hasn't been a crime swell. Now, the vulnerability on that is the fact that you do have cities where Democratic voters can walk by and see undocumented folks or people who've crossed the border sleeping on the floor. There was a big hoo-ha in Chicago about where the city was trying to manage resources to find housing for these folks, but they weren't able to muster that same energy for Black Americans who were suffering from housing insecurity or from housing insecurity in general in a lot of these cities. So that is one vulnerability that the Democrats are going to have to look out for. Writ large, I do think that undermines the Republican argument that crime is just raging over the border. That's simply not true, and the data doesn't support it. But that doesn't mean that that has completely escaped as a campaign issue, or that it's not going to be a factor on the Democratic side.
Joel, let me ask you this as we close out. We know that issues always matter in campaigns, but so does money. And if you don't have a lot of money in your war chest, it's tough to define the other guy as well as yourself. It seems like Biden's got a lot of money. It seems like the Republicans have issues when it comes to money. How much of that is going to be a factor in this campaign?
Well, Biden had a great night. His best night of the campaign, raised over $10 million after the State of the Union. But there are also two expenditures for Trump and one for Biden. For Biden, it's about winning the White House. For Trump, A, it's about winning the White House, and B, it's about staying out of jail. He has a major drag on his fundraising to pay for his legal bills. So a lot of that money is going to go in the wrong direction. So money for President Biden is going to be very strong, and he's going to be able to be up on the air as he is right now in all these key states, and has a significant amount of momentum behind him because of that State of the Union address, which really did shift momentum within the Democratic Party.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating race to watch, whether or not people are excited about it or not. We are. We're excited to have all of you on this show. Thank you so much for your insights. Always great talking to all four of you. Thanks again. And that's going to do it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. We'll see you next time.